Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with Linda. I'm Linda Daniels, and you are now inside Northampton Wools, our little yarn store in Northampton, Mass. I am so glad that all of you are with us today on this really magical eclipse day. I hope you all have your glasses. We just got glasses from a customer, although I do have some at home, but I'll be taking these home for Adrian to use as well. Be sure you wear them because we don't want any damage done during that whole episode. It is certainly a significant day in a lot of ways for people with this eclipse coming, and I hope that you enjoy watching it and create a legend for your family. If not a legend, at least a story. Hey Eileen, hi Dale. This will be one of those, oh yeah, I remember that eclipse day when the world went a little eclipse nuts. And you'll be able to tell your grandchildren and maybe even great-grandchildren of what your experience was during this day. It's been quite a week with the earthquake, the snow, and now the eclipse. Holy cow. Well, as many of you know, I leave on Wednesday for a knitting tour in Ireland. We leave from Boston and we'll be gone for 10 days. And we're going to be touring around southwestern Ireland, flying into Shannon, and we'll be doing 4 knitting classes. One of the things that we're going to be doing is going out, taking a ferry out to the Aran Islands and having a class out there with an Aran Island knitter. I'm really looking forward to that. It looks like the projects that we're going to be doing are all relatively small, either hats or mittens, and have lots of cables in them. So I think that's going to be an awful lot of fun. I am sure looking forward to having the opportunity to learn more and from someone else and not necessarily being the teacher during that whole process. Although I have a group of 24 people that are going with me, most of whom are knitters. Although I'm not teaching, I will be available for help sessions at night when we're back in the hotel. So I think it will be a really great experience for everybody. I will be posting Instagram and Facebook updates, maybe not every night, but as often as possible. And I will still do a live next Monday to kind of catch you up with what we are doing and what is happening during the whole time. So look for those. Although I won't be in the shop, you will still be able to connect with me and see what I'm doing and what I'm experiencing. So I hope that you will all stay tuned for that and keep a lookout for those posts. One of the teachers is Carol Fuller, who is pretty well known as an Irish knitter, and she'll actually be with us for 2 days, going on a little tour of the countryside with us as well. So I titled this Debunking Knitting Myths and Legends for a couple of reasons. One of which is that I will be in Ireland and going to the Aran Islands and experiencing the Irish knits. And the other reason is because I had customers in here on Saturday who were looking for patterns or books of patterns of Irish knits. And I was like, not like the old days, like 40 years ago. So if you really want to find an Aran sweater, you have 2 choices. You can hunt on Ravelry, because certainly there are a number of designers who are doing what I would classify as Aran sweater patterns with updated yarns and needles and even some updated patterns. But there aren't a lot of books out there that are filled just with those patterns. The other thing that we talked briefly about was the myth that Aran sweaters have meaning behind them. Now, don't shoot me. I'm really nervous about this, but it's the truth. And I want to kind of debunk some of those things. But I want to preface this by saying that During my time in Ireland, I will be the last person that gets into any kind of argument with any kind of Irish knitter or teacher who tries to tell our group about these myths and legends. I will keep my mouth shut. Because eventually a myth or a legend can become reality. It may not be based in truth, but it can become truth. And I'm going to explain that to you a little bit further. So the very first time that this topic came up was with Richard Rutt's book, A History of Hand Knitting. And I happen to have a copy of it here. It is a treasured piece in my library. I'm going to take the plastic off so it doesn't reflect so much. Back when I first started working at Northampton Wools, there were probably only about, at the most, very most, 10 knitting books published in a year. And I read my way from cover to cover in I read every single one that came through the doors of the store. And we pretty much ordered every single book when it came out. So I read Richard Rutt's book when it first appeared and learned a lot about hand knitting. Now, you can probably find it in the library. Of course, it's no longer in print. You might find a used copy at a tag sale or a used bookstore or even on Amazon. If you are a history buff or want to learn more about knitting, it's a wonderful place to begin, although it is very dry, and probably a chapter a night would be a pretty remarkable way to approach it. But in this book, he talks about Aran knitting, and there's probably about 4 pages in which he describes what he has found out through research. And although, or one of the myths right away about knitting Aran sweaters is that it's an ancient craft. It is not. It's probably not more than 120 years old, which in itself is pretty startling. But knitting is really a fairly modern craft. Although knitted socks have been around for a long time, it is not. Knitted sweaters are not something that was part of the everyday costume or wardrobe, because it just took too long. It was much faster and quicker to weave material and then cut and sew something. So in 1936, there was a book published called The Island of Ireland, and it had lots and lots of photographs, not one of which was of an Aran sweater. But shortly after that, in 1954, there was a book published called The People of the Sea. And in that book, men and fishermen were shown to be wearing navy or gray sweaters that had designs from the yoke up, what we now think of as a traditional Guernsey or Guernsey style. That was the norm. And this is documented in several different places. In 1955, Gladys Thompson published a book called Patterns for Guernsey and Jerseys. Guernseys and Jerseys. And that actually began kind of the interest in that style of knitting. So not that long ago. A book that you can probably still find. Again, it's probably out of print. It's a small book with lots of historic pictures from the early 1900s. In Richard Rutt's book, he debunks a lot of those myths, and it sort of was a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy. Once somebody made a claim that many of the Aran patterns, or some of the Aran patterns, were based on designs that were found in the Book of Kells, that sort of romanticized it, and everybody jumped on board, and all of a sudden we find legends growing and growing and growing. It is not true that fishermen were identified by the patterns on their sweaters. It's not true. Where that myth came from is actually a play that was written in which the two of the characters, two women, identify a fisherman by the dropped stitches in a sock. And that was all it took. It ballooned and became a kind of standard, oh, well, we can tell because this cable was prominent in this area and that stitch really happened over there. Again, some of that is true because knitters share, and back then that was it. There were very few patterns written. How to make something was a very oral craft. You were taught by an aunt or your mother and shown different things. And actually Richard Rutt names two women who left Ireland to settle in the States, decided that it was not for them, but learned a lot about knitting in the States, took it back to Ireland, and helped develop the Aran traditions that we now know. So even though we call it an Irish knit, it actually came from the United States. I'm telling the truth. Don't shoot me. It wasn't until the 50s that Aran sweaters actually began to show up. A lot of the Aran knitting was based on famine. It came out of a famine, and knitting was seen as a way for women to earn some extra money. And then we also add the tourism in there, and it was, people realized that if they told a few extra stories, the Aran designs would be more desirable. So the classic Aran sweaters became more and more romanticized and more desirable by tourists. In the United States, we have Eleanor Bernat to thank for a lot of the what we think of as Irish designs. This is just one of them. If you come across a Bernat book of Irish knits, and there were many, grab it and hold on to it. I don't know if you can tell, but this one is pretty ratty and it makes me sneeze because the paper is fast disintegrating. But this was published in 1986, in the 80s, people. But Eleanor Bernat is mainly responsible and gets very little credit for the amount of designs that she published and created. And any of the books that you see like this have what we have come to recognize as Irish knit, or what we call Irish knit. Yes, it's true. Her family, and she married into a family of mills in Ireland, and the original yarn, the Blarney spun yarn, was spun at a mill in Ireland. But the sweaters were not created in Ireland. They were actually created and popularized here, and then brought back to Ireland and used as a way of earning more money. So grab these, hang on to them, because they are real treasures. It's also not true that all of the Irish sweaters were knit with this unbleached, white, heavy, oily yarn. They were actually more often done with an indigo dye rather than with that white yarn. We then move ahead to Alice Starmore. And most of you, if you've been knitting for a while, know the Alice Starmore name. This is a paperback copy of her original book, Alice Starmore's Aran Knitting. This is what the hardcover looks like. At one point in the 2000s, this book was selling for over $300 on eBay. It was that popular, and we before we really got into being able to reprint things. Well, she has probably the first half of the book goes into a lot of detail about the history of knitting in Ireland and the islands, and she's from the Outer Hebrides. Her designs are gorgeous and beautiful, updated, fancy, and only for the experienced knitter. A beginner knitter will have trouble with some of her designs. At the end of the history, she has a section that talks about her conclusions from all of the research that she has done. And those are the things that I wanted to share with you. The conclusion number one is that the Aran sweater was developed from the tradition of the Scottish Guernsey. Those are the sweaters where basically from the armhole up, there's some sort of stitch pattern, often cables. That's where it began. Aran women learned Guernsey knitting skills from a Scottish source or sources. For each of these statements, Alice has paragraphs of research that support all of those things. The Aran sweater was not first made as a fisherman's sweater. It was actually made for commercial benefit, to sell to tourists. The impetus behind the development of the Aran sweater was commercial. It was a way of selling something to tourists, creating an industry based on a particular style. Any tradition involving the Aran sweaters is of recent origin, maybe beginning only in 1946. And contrary to belief, the Aran sweater was not made from heavy, unscoured, naturally oily wool, but spun oily wool. It was not spun right from a sheep's back. No, it was not. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And one of the things that I find really interesting about it is that these myths, these stories have helped create not only the industry of knitting, but the technique of knitting. These Irish sweaters, these Aran sweaters are traditionally knit flat and then sewn together, not knit in the round. They were done, like I said, with indigo dye or with yarn that had been washed and cleaned and stripped of some of the oil, not completely taken out. That fishermen were not identified by the patterns in there, but the patterns, the stitches, were shared among knitters in lots of different regions. So part of that is true. There is such a thing as regional design and regional knitting, which is why we have a tradition like Aran knitting. Fair Isle too is not that old. It is a fairly recent creation. The lace work from Russia, in the Russian shawls, that is its own unique kind of craft and stitch patterns, shared and then embellished upon. And it led me to thinking about how wonderful this craft of ours is, because it is so alive. It's changing and growing. And the way that happens is through sharing. And now with the internet and Ravelry, we have a way of sharing things almost as soon as they're created. And it just keeps evolving in so many different and interesting ways that we can barely keep up with all of the things that are created. Plus, I am a real believer that the universe sends a message out there and it's picked up in a lot of different places by a lot of different people. The prime example I have of that is that I took a lot of classes with a wonderful woman named Kat Bordy, who is no longer with us. And when she first self-published her book about knitting socks on 2 circular needles, almost at the exact same time, somebody came up with magic loop. It was almost instantaneous. So that idea went out there, and the universe hoped that more than one person picked it up and ran with it, which they did. It's just amazing to me how knitting, even in the last 40 years that I've owned the business, has changed and grown, and always changed for the better. Knitting from the top down in the round is almost a standard now, whereas even 25 years ago, it was rare. and considered a challenge to do. Barbara Walker in the 50s wrote one of the first top-down knitting books. I think it's even called Top Down and In the Round. And truthfully, those are some of the most unappealing sweaters that you can imagine. It's one of those classically ugly books, but the technique is there. That's what started the whole, oh, I can do it this way and then I don't have to sew it together. So it's been really, really thrilling to think about and watch the changes over the years that now top down and in the round is almost standard. It's almost hard to find a sweater that's written flat that you then have to seam. So take those legends with a grain of salt. My feeling coming away from this is that the legends and myth can become true. And if they're not true, then what they really do is keep the craft alive and changing. Keep it interesting and desirable. Create the desire, the want, the joy that one gets from sharing a craft like this. So look for those things on Ravelry. Look for that book or anything by Eleanor Bernat, and hang on to it. Probably now in flea markets and used bookstores, you might come across some copies of them. I think probably, I'm not sure that all of them have been listed on Ravelry because they may still be owned. Bernat Company is still in business under the Yarnspirations umbrella, so they're still out there producing things as we continue to grow this whole kind of community and world. I have been so blessed and so fortunate that this has been my life for so long. And I hope that I have, at least in my family, created my own legends and myths surrounding knitting, as I'm sure all of you have too. If you are the only knitter in your family, certainly there will be stories told about you. We've all heard, I've heard over and over stories of, great Aunt Jean who has knit all of the Christmas stockings for the entire family. Those are the kinds of things that legends are made out of. So when you create your own legend and your own myth, relish it, enjoy it, and go knit something.